Our topic this morning, also quite an important and sensitive topic that addresses the relationship of the nation of Israel, not necessarily the citizens of the land of Israel presently, but the entire Jewish people to the other nations of the world. As we know, God created a single human from whom all humanity then comes forth. A single human, initially a combination, probably a androgynous person with fully developed male and female formations, connected at the spinal cord, back to back. A human that consisted of a male-female interactive process. And at that time, humanity could have continued through that individual creature, male-female creature, with the dominance being the male. God then separated the male from the female, and man and woman became individuals to complement and to assist each other. From there came all of mankind, primarily 70 nations. Those nations emanated from two different sources: Cain and Shais. Hevel, as you know, was murdered by his brother. And so one of the tributaries that became the origin of mankind already had experienced the ultimate aspect of violence, fratricide, not only murder, but murder of a brother. And the murder was done in extremely violent ways. Our rabbis explain how Cain killed Hevel. He tried many different ways because it was the first person to ever kill another human being. No one had ever died before. So they didn't know exactly how this end of life would take place to eradicate Hevel. And so he utilized multiple wounds and violent tactics until he killed him. And then, watching a bird being buried, recognized that burial is the right place to be after killing someone, besides the fact that it would be a good hiding place. But nonetheless, one of the ancestral origins is Cain, who becomes a hunted man after that and a wandering person. Multiple generations later, his own great-great-great-grandson kills him. And so that violence is perpetuated in a certain fashion. And as we know, some of the elements that we experience ourselves are, whether genetically or you might call epigenetics, which is a new concept that has been coined in the field of psychotherapy, but behavioral genetics also are transmitted from generation to generation. So that you find, for example, that you'll have children or grandchildren walk in the same way as their grandfather did, or hold their hands in the same way, or sleep in the same pattern, or wear their yarmulke in the same pattern. I have a little nephew that never met my father, and he wears his yarmulke exactly the way he did and sleeps the way he did. And they've now determined that there's such a thing as epigenetics, which is very important to note because of other issues in our society, which is nature and nurture arguments in terms of behavioral patterns and how that can be altered. But nonetheless, behavior of earlier generations, they impact later generations in a very powerful and forceful manner. Another interesting perspective of that is the fact that we have a Jewish axiom, and probably it's true in every language, that one mother, one set of parents can take care of 10 children, and 10 children have a tough time taking care of one set of parents or one parent. And you might ask, what is the reason for that? Because it should be just the opposite. Because the child owes the parent much more than the parent owes the child. One of the reasons it says in the Torah, honor your father and mother, even when they do not behave to you as your psychiatrist might say they should have, is because they gave you life, period. They gave you the greatest gift. So why is it that children have that notion? And from one perspective, it's quite simple. Adam, the first man, he had children, but he had no parents. So he didn't have any emotion to parents because he didn't have any parents. So what he conveyed to his children was a feeling of a parent to children, but he couldn't convey a feeling of a child to a parent. And so it continued in some kind of a chain reaction, therefore. And that's why it's interesting that one of the mitzvahs in the Torah is not to love your parent. It never says love your parent. It says honor your parent. Have awe for your parent. Respect your parent. So the fact is that when a generation is spawned in violence, that violence may continue for a long time. And so you might say that half of the world, or a good part of the world, has within themselves certain aspects of this nature. Nonetheless, God created from these two, 1 to 2, to then multiple generations, created 70 nations. Those 70 nations are the foundation of the civilized universe. All of those 70 nations. And they are enumerated when you talk about the children of Noah and their children and grandchildren. These 70 nations were meant by God to come into this world and create a civilized world. There is a 71st nation. One nation that is different than those 70 nations, and that's the Jewish nation. We come from the family of Shem, one of Noah's sons, and from Shem came many offspring. One of those offsprings gave birth to Abraham, and from that point on, the Jew had a direct lineage. Though, until the third generation from Abraham, Jacob, we shared that lineage with other nations as well. For example, two of the most remarkable nations that come out of our own ancestry, from Abraham and Isaac. From Abraham comes Ishmael. Now, Ishmael is not necessarily what you would call the entire Muslim nation, or all the people that live in Arab countries. You know, after Nebuzaradan, after the time of Nebuchadnezzar, they came and they mixed all of the nations when he conquered the world. They did like the experiment in Cambodia, Kampuchea, to be able to undo local loyalties to governments and to families. They moved people from one province to another in order for them to lose contact with their original environment. And so today, those inhabitants of the countries surrounding Israel that refer to themselves as Arabs or Muslims or other different types are not necessarily the Ishmaelites that came from Abraham. That's one of the nations that we know about that is very remarkable. Another one that may be even more remarkable is offspring from Isaac. One of Isaac's offsprings is Esau. Now, Esau himself, who was a twin of Jacob, he was the one that came out first, actually. So he was technically the older one. He himself, our rabbis tell us, one day in the time of Mashiach, will repent and come back to his original sources and origins. However, one of the offspring of Esav was Hitler, Haman, possibly Ahmadinejad. I'm not sure if he comes from the same line, even though he has the same ideology. Came the worst haters of the Jewish people, and the one nation that we are commanded to eradicate. We are commanded to treat all nations in a kind and positive manner. Some of the nations, we are warned never to not only go to battle with them, but even to harm them in any way or to scare them in any way, like Ammon and Moab and Esav. But there is a nation called Amalek, who is considered to be the radical evil of the world. And sometimes, no matter how socially conscious you are and how liberal-minded your thinking patterns are, some radical evil cannot be altered and must be eradicated. That nation comes from Isaac, Amalek. And then from Jacob comes the pure line of the Jewish people. But those Jewish people yet were not formally Jewish at that point. And that really is an issue that we should understand to some extent to understand the relationship that we have with other nations. The formality of Jewish nationhood, or the formality of our becoming Jewish people in the fullest sense, took place at Mount Sinai. In fact, our rabbis in the Talmud extract the laws of conversion from the event at Mount Sinai when all the Jewish people were formally converted and became officially Jews. Though we stem from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and were Jews from that perspective, we were genetically Jewish. We were behaviorally Jewish. But we were not yet fully, legally considered to be Jews, and therefore, until that time, did not have the obligation to fulfill the mitzvahs or the commandments that are incumbent upon every single Jew. The formality took place in the year 2448. Ezekiel, when he talks about the Jewish people and their becoming a Jew, refers to it as the birth of one nation from the womb of another. As the Jewish people come out of Egypt, it's the birth of a nation from the womb of another nation. The technical terms in Hebrew, lokachas legoy mikerev goy, to take a nation from among other nations. So what is the continuing relationship between this goy echad, this one nation, and the shivim goyim, the 70 nations, or the shivim umos, the 70 nationalities? It's also important to know that the word goy, that many people use to refer to someone who is not of the Jewish faith, is not a derogatory or condescending term, because the Jewish people also are called goy. They are the 70 goyim, and we are the one goy. And each person, parenthetically, also has a goy within us ourselves, that kind of attitude that a goy, the other 70 goyim have. The derogatory term, if you want to know what that is, it's shegitz or shiksa. When you heard the word shegitz or shiksa, that's a derogatory term, because that word comes from the word shkutz, which is something that is unpleasant, something that you must extract, that you must throw away, that you must spit out, so to speak. But goy is the term that is very respectful. As our rabbis tell us regarding the nations, that when Mashiach comes, the whole world will not become Jewish. Because otherwise, who's going to handle the electric grid on Shabbos? Or other kinds of necessary aspects that a civilized world needs. Let's just take a look for a moment at what are the obligations of the nations of the world. The prophet Zephaniah says that in the time of Mashiach, all nations will gather, and they will serve God with one purpose, so that there will be an amalgamation of nations that will continue to live and prosper during the time of Mashiach. Those nations will be part of our civilized world. At that time, those nations who will have already forsaken violence and evil and hatred and all of those negative elements that make up today those of the world that put fear into people's lives. Because as the prophet says, and as Maimonides rules, there will be no empty competitiveness, there will be no wars. And as he quotes from the prophet Isaiah, that armaments will be transformed to productive vessels of agriculture or other aspects of civilization that would be the norm of the time. In the time of Isaiah, the sophistication was in agriculture. Today, the sophistication might be in space technology, in other factors. But instead of the effort being put forth in the research and refinement of mechanisms to murder and to annihilate, those same brains will be utilized in order to put together the kinds of necessary aspects that make the world a better place. Can you imagine if all the brains that work in all of the sophisticated sources of technology and research would be working, all of those brains, on developing a cure for some of the diseases that afflict the world today that we still do not have a handle on? Probably if instead of working on how to make a better bomb or how to make a better laser equipment that could destroy, we would be working on utilizing those same extraordinary capacity to be able to elevate the world. Those nations at that time, what will be their obligation and what are their obligations today? As we recognize that the nations of the world are God's creatures, and you must not mistreat any one of God's creatures, fellow humans, to such a degree, you might say, that there are certain laws where you have to be more careful in how you deal with them with one of the other nations than how you deal with them with a Jewish person. I'll give you one example. According to Jewish law, the minimum value where a person is guilty of stealing or fraud is a pruta. A pruta, let us say, is a penny. If a person takes less than a penny from a fellow Jew, it's not considered legally to be stealing, and the person from whom it is taken cannot utilize legal means in which to retrieve it. So with a Jew, you're not guilty unless you take something that's worth more than a pruta. However, with one of the other nations, you are guilty even if you take something from them that is less than a pruta. Contrary to many people's perspectives that are wrongly stated that it's okay to defraud someone who is not Jewish, someone who's not Jewish, you have to be much more careful than someone who is Jewish for the simple reason of what we call chilul Hashem. When you take something away from some of the other nations, it desecrates God's name. You are responsible for the desecration and for putting a stain on God's chosen children and therefore a stain on God. And so in certain instances, you must be even more careful in how you deal with a non-Jewish person than how you deal with a Jewish person. What are the obligations of these 70 nations? Do they just get a free ride in the world, do whatever they want? As I say to many people who come to me potentially for conversion purposes, I say to them, why would you want to place yourself in a circumstance where even under the most distressing conditions, in the middle of the holiest Jewish day of the year, Yom Kippur, you can calmly have a sandwich, a cheeseburger, and still go to heaven? Why would you want to limit yourself? You still have a heavenly environment that's waiting for you. And how do you get to heaven? By eating cheeseburgers. So Maimonides' rules, based on the Talmudic discussion. When God created Adam, you might say, if he would not have eaten from the tree of knowledge, which was, as we know today, not possible, because the way he was set up, it was like a real setup where he couldn't get out of it. And there's all kinds of discussions in Jewish philosophy and in Kabbalah, and how did God make that setup happen? And did he really have free choice? And if he would have, could he have chosen not to eat that tree, that fruit, if he wanted to, and so forth? But that's not the discussion for today. But Adam, when he was created, the language that is used to talk about the Jewish uniqueness, the Jewish soul, is that which God gave to Adam. The Jewish soul is referred to in Hasidic philosophy as the nefesh elokis, the godly soul, that Almighty God breathed, blew into the nostrils of man. Breath of God was introduced into man. That breath of God, vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim, and he blew into Adam's nostrils the breath of life. And again, it's interesting to note nostrils, but again, that's not the discussion for today. Why did he blow into the nostrils? We know that in resuscitation, the best place to blow is into someone's mouth. So why did he use that? That's, again, just bringing points so that you know that the discussions that you have here are quite limited in their scope, and there's so much more to learn, just from a simple point of view. So that was the godly soul that he breathed into Adam. So how come not everybody else is Jewish? So the Holy Ari, the 15th century Kabbalist, 16th century Kabbalist, who is considered to be the singular Kabbalist for our times, from which Hasidic philosophy emanates, writes that when he ate from the tree of knowledge, that godly soul was suspended, went into suspension, and then re-entered Abraham. And that's why the progeny of Adam until Abraham are considered members of the other 70 nations. However, before even Abraham's birth, both with Adam and with Noah, God gave them rules by which to live. Rules of civilization. Those rules. And I quote, this is chapter 1, halacha 1, chapter 9 of the last book of Maimonides, the book of Kings, which also includes the laws about Mashiach. 6 precepts were commanded to Adam. The prohibition against the worship of false gods, the prohibition against cursing God, the prohibition against murder, the prohibition against incest and adultery, the prohibition against theft, the command to establish laws and courts of justice. And then there was an additional mitzvah given to Noah, and that's not to eat part of a live animal. Cruelty to animals. Now these mitzvahs, if you look at them carefully, all of them have ancillary commandments that surround these mitzvahs. So these 7, according to some opinions, number up to 90 or 60. There are many more that emanate from this. And these are only commandments that are the prohibitions. There are other commandments that come into the focus of humanness. But for example, the prohibition against murder could be extrapolated to mean not only cutting off someone's head or physically killing them, but also embarrassing somebody where their blood rushes to their face. Or have you ever heard someone say, I wanted to bury myself? I was so embarrassed. I thought I was going to die. Someone becomes pale and white and their blood is drained from them. That is also akin to murder. In fact, our rabbis do say that certain gossip is like murdering somebody. Murdering someone's reputation is as potent as murdering somebody's physical body. In fact, it could be more than that, because when you kill a body, you kill only one generation. When you kill someone's reputation, you might be killing multiple generations. And so murder does not only include physical murder. And incest and adultery would include multiple types of transgressions in that area. The laws of theft would not only include taking somebody's money out of their pocket, but fraud, lying, not giving full disclosure. Many of the elements that you might not consider to be the word theft itself. And not eating part of a live animal includes cruelty to animals in every single way. And so these mitzvahs that is incumbent upon the nations of the world, all of them, these 7, again, can be expanded to many more. Not 613, but 60, 100, 90. These mitzvahs, Maimonides rules, are not just mitzvahs that a person can accept because they make sense. They're logical. One of the fundamentals in the difference between the mitzvahs that a Jew is obligated to do and the nations are obligated to do is very critical. It's germane to our whole notion of the difference between a Jew and the other nations. All mitzvahs, all commandments, all obligations that the nations of the world are obligated to fulfill are logical. They all make sense. They don't have to wear black boxes on their heads. They don't have to put scrolls on their doors. They don't have to be limited to not eat pork. They can eat anything they want. In fact, eating pork makes the least sense. Not eating pork makes the least sense of any other animal. The Talmud tells us in the Tractate Tanit that there are certain circumstances by which the courts can impose fast days on the community. When there is an outbreak of a plague, then the courts can establish a fast. When there's a drought for a certain period of time, the courts can establish a fast. When there is a plague among the horses, the courts cannot establish a fast. When there's a plague among cows, bovine, the courts cannot establish a fast. But if there's a plague among swine, pigs, the courts can establish a fast. And the commentaries tell us right away, thousands of years ago, or more, actually Rashi exclaims it, but the Talmud, written 1600 years ago, immediately tells us that why, when there's a plague among the pigs, can you establish a fast? Because the pig is the closest biological animal to the human. And today, we already know it when in the 1970s, Professor Kirkland developed the pig valve, which even today is considered to be one of the best natural valves to replace valves of the person's heart. But already the Talmud tells us that a long time ago. So Rashi tells us, for example, our rabbis tell us that the laws about which they laugh at us are like the laws of not eating pig. Why can't you eat pig? Or the laws of not wearing clothing that have wool or linen, which means if you're wearing a jacket and it's made out of pure wool and somebody sews the buttons with linen threads, you can't wear that jacket. Those are the laws that make no sense. So all the laws that are incumbent upon the nations of the world are logical and rational, whereas the laws that the Jewish people have are what we might say super rational, beyond logic, laws that we do not have any kind of interpretation for. And even when, for example, tefillin, and you can somehow give some interpretation of the meaning of tefillin, putting it on your hand, facing the heart, on your head, with the brain, the integration of the intellect and emotion, which naturally in many humans are at odds with each other and conflict. The head says no, and the heart says, I want it anyways. Or the heart says, do it, and the head says, I'm not doing it, etc. So we connect the head and the heart, and we submit it to a higher power, and we can make all kinds of interesting, philosophical, meaningful reasons for wrapping tefillin, or any other mitzvah for that matter. Maimonides, in his Guide for the Perplexed, even gives some reasoning for not wearing wool and linen. But why do the tefillin have to be black? And why square? And why in the head is the 4 boxes in the head is 1 box? So there are so many issues that really are beyond logic for the Jew. They come from a higher source. However, the non-Jewish person, all of his mitzvahs are rational, logical, and make sense. And so when we move to, you might say, the next level of what the objective of that is, the objective of the nations of the world is to create civilization, a civilized world, a world that operates in a proper order, a world where there is kindness and decency, a world that each one of us is looking forward to as a proper world where we can safely raise our children, and when we don't have to have fears when our children are a half hour late coming back from school as to what might have happened to them. And we are becoming ever more careful for people that come to visit our homes and they want our children to sit on their laps. Simple facts of life that we look forward to being reconstructed in a positive manner. Civilization. God did not create the world for chaos. He created the world for order. Today, the world is in a chaotic stage, but we have realization of civilization, of order. Though there are those that try to upset the apple cart from time to time, most of the world today already is moving towards a sense of normalcy. Most people, even in environments and countries where there is all kinds of violence and terror, and are the birthplaces of violence and terror, the majority of the people in those environments also just want to live peacefully and to raise their children and to make sure that everything goes well. But there is still the pocket of crazies, as we have here in this country, and working in the prison system, where we work with more than 5,000 Jewish men and women and a few 100,000 other peoples. You know that there are crazies in the world. Not only individual nutcases like in Colorado, but collective nutcases that live in how to take advantage of society. Civilization. But that civilization needs to be imbued with holiness, with godliness, with a sense of transcendence, with an authority, which is the Jewish nation's obligation. Whereas the nations of the world have to create civilization, the Jew has to imbue that civilization with holiness. And so Maimonides rules in chapter 10 of Laws of Kings Law 10. And I gave it as a handout. Moses only gave the Torah and mitzvahs as an inheritance to Israel. As Deuteronomy states, the Torah is the inheritance of the congregation of Jacob. And to all those who desire to convert from among the other nations, as Numbers states, the convert shall be the same as you. And again, interestingly, whereas you have a single mitzvah to love your fellow Jew as you love yourself, you have a double mitzvah to love a convert. It says you must love the convert and you must love your fellow Jew as yourself. But again, I believe that the word that is used for ger is incorrect. It's not convert. It doesn't say convert means someone who changes. The word ger means naturalized. It's like a naturalized citizen. There's a born citizen and there's a naturalized citizen. So the proper term for someone who we refer to as a convert would be a naturalized Jew, someone who chose through their own effort to take on the obligations of being Jewish. So this person who is naturalized must be treated like every one of them. However, someone who does not desire to accept Torah and mitzvahs should not be forced to. And again, parenthetically, it's another subject in itself. Forcing doesn't mean putting a gun to someone's head and say, convert. Forcing means, if you don't convert, I can't marry you. It's also psychological force. And as we know, psychological force can be as powerful as physical force, as we now know in the court system, that people of authority, when imposing their behavior on people that are under their guidance, are considered to have forced those people, not necessarily by tying their hands. So forcing today, most of the conversions are by forced conversions, because the people who convert would rather not convert it. They don't convert because they can't live the way they do. They have to be Jewish. And the proof of it is, as I've experienced in my career, one particular person, and I don't do, quote, conversions, but have participated in a number of them in the many years of my work. And in one case, a young man who was from a traditional family, a very fine person, very successful, top of the game in his field. And he wanted to marry this nice lady who wasn't Jewish, but this nice lady wanted to be Jewish. And so we put her through a very, very tough program, and she, quote, went through a proper conversion and decided to live like a Jew. But her husband didn't want to live like a Jew. So she's trying to keep Shabbos, and he's going to the football games or whatever else they wanted to do on Shabbos. And she said, what happened? I just became Jewish, and I want to live this way. She said, don't worry about it. I'm Jewish too. Nothing is going to happen. So sometimes you have those cases, so you know that the conversion process that takes place today across the board, 99% of people who convert do it for marriage reasons, which is psychological force. That's just not the topic that we're talking about. By the same regard, this is the important line. By the same regard, Moses was commanded by the Almighty to compel all the inhabitants of the world to accept the commandments given to Noah's descendants. The Jew is obligated to make sure that the non-Jewish nations keep those commandments. This acceptance must be made in the presence of Torah scholars, which means he must accept it not because God gave it to Noah and Adam. That was just the parameters. However, he must accept it because God gave those commandments from Sinai. The commandments are not to be done because they make sense, because they're logical and rational, and because they create a decent world and a decent society. They must be accepted because God gave them. And the test of that you know that it's critical to accept them because God gave them, not because they make sense. Sometimes you have to look far and wide to find some environment or some example that will test this particular philosophy, this particular theory. Here you don't have to look far. Take the Nazis. Germany. Germany was the most civilized, the most sophisticated nation at the turn of the 20th century and further on. They developed the best musicians, the best technology. They still develop the best technology. The best philosophy. They had Wagner and Bach and Brahms and Beethoven. And they had Nietzsche and Kant and Feuerbach, philosophers that are still required reading in all the Ivy League schools. And technology that is still desired all over the world. Their cars, their pens, their manufacturing machines, their business modalities. If you take a look in the economic environment, they developed the best of everything. And they also developed Bergen, Belsen, and Buchenwald. How is that possible? That this extraordinary nation, and in fact, they didn't create Bergen, Belsen, and Buchenwald like happened in the Ukraine, where a bunch of Cossacks were just bloodthirsty, murdering, greedy animals that murdered people wantonly. This was a systemic process that emanated from Nietzsche. The Nordic supremacy concept. The idea that there is the superhuman, the Obersmensch, the superhuman person. Or as they developed it in their philosophical systems, referring to humanity, like in the animal kingdom, as the eagle and the rat. The Germans were the eagle and the Jews were the rat. And by nature, by the natural process of evolutionary choices, the eagle hunts the rat and consumes him. And so, this sophisticated nation that would eat only by the most exquisite music and would make sure that their housekeepers wore white gloves when they served them and made sure that they kissed their little children every single morning and told them how much they loved them and took care of their dogs as if they were humans, also murdered more than 1 million children. How is that possible? 1.5 million children. It's because it was left to the human rationale. The human rationale is one that has much imperfection because it's governed by the instinctive human self, which includes a massive ego that, when expressed properly, brings out pride of humanity, and when expressed improperly, brings out greed and hate and the need to overcome others. So the Torah says that the reason that the nations of the world must keep these logical, rational commands are not because they make sense, but because God said so. Yes, they do make sense. But God says do it because you must do it even when you don't want to. Because many times we don't want to do things that make sense because we're touched in such a way that we don't care. Like people who do destructive things at moments of anger or to get even with someone, revenge and other such factors. So the Torah says there's a safety valve. The safety valve is that Yesh Balabayis Libirazu, there's a master to the universe. And it's the Jew that is obligated to share, to teach, and to embed in the nation's minds that concept of holiness and godliness, that there is a God in the universe. And there is an owner to the universe that operates and runs everything and conducts everything and watches everything. And it's not even difficult to comprehend. Today, we're closer than ever to that point, where the world will come to recognize that. Even heretofore, scholars, secular scholars, scientists, who rejected any notion of a supernatural being or supernatural forces, today speak quite comfortably about intelligent design. That there is an intelligence to the design of the universe. And it only makes sense. If you think about the sophistication of the universe, the fact that our globe, this orb of Earth that we call our home, that 24,000 mile circumference of space that we inhabit is less than a single drop in the ocean compared to what we know exists. We now surmise, and the new word is not looking at our creation as a universe, but now science is referring to this massive being as a multiverse. They say there are many universes. And within each universe, they're seeing multiple galaxies. Many galaxies as great as the Milky Way. We're already able to see 12.5 billion light years away. Oh, you can't even imagine how far that is. The closest star, Alpha Centauri, is 3 light years away. And if you had a spaceship that was traveling at 25,000 miles a minute, that's faster than anything we can even imagine. It would take 700 years for the return trip. 700 years, that's the closest star. So when we talk about 12.5 billion light years, not 3, massive, that's what we see. And so the sophistication of creating this massive universe, or imagine, just one little imagination so you know what intelligent design is. That just by looking at the formation of the stars that are light years away, that the light that we see according to science has already traveled eons to get to us, which means the star that originated that light might be dead already. Yet that light that we see in the far horizon is stationed in such a perfect symmetry to our Earth that a shipman can take his little boat and start out from England and come straight to Argentina and know exactly where he's going just by following something that's light years away. That's millions of light years away. And it's perfect in that structure, where here he lands within 100 feet of where he's going, just by navigating the stars. Imagine the perfection of that system. Pretty intelligent to create that kind of a formation. And to keep it in place, doesn't just, what is it hanging on? Can you imagine keeping this Earth in place? It doesn't move a couple of inches here, a couple of inches there, falls a couple of feet, rises a couple of feet. I mean, we're just floating around in space. And no big pillars that are holding us. This is not about some giant that's got the earth on his shoulders. It is about that, but an invisible giant that carries the world in an extraordinary way. And so once you recognize that there's intelligent design, we're getting really close to the fact that there is an owner to this universe. Because if he has the brains to create it, he must also have a purpose for creating it, because the brain also contains a reason, a raison d'etre. And that's so critical. And so the nations of the world have a very vital mission to fulfill, to create a civilized universe. And the Jew has the vital mission to imbue that civilization with holiness. And the Jew must not give up his sacred mission and must not in any way mix the mission of the rest of the nations into an unknown concoction that becomes very unclear. I'll just end with one interesting little story from the Rebbe. There was a gentleman whose son was about to marry a non-Jewish woman. Troubled him very much. This is many years ago, in the early years of the Rebbe. And he wanted them to meet the Rebbe. And he asked the Rebbe if he could please talk to them about not intermarrying. And the Rebbe said, of course he will talk to them, but what can he say to these people? He doesn't know them, they don't know him. He says, no, the gentleman told the Rebbe in private audience, those were the days when you had more interaction with the Rebbe privately. He says, the Rebbe will, he says, they know about the Rebbe and they will respect you. So the Rebbe saw them. And they said, we love each other and so forth. So the Rebbe said to this young lady, do you really love this man? She said, yes, I do. And he said to the man, do you really love this woman? She says, yes, I do. Then if you really love each other, selflessly, not because you want something, but you love that person, then leave each other alone. Because otherwise you'll be hurting each other's souls. And so different is not to tolerate the other nation. Tolerance is not the right word. It's to recognize and to accept each person for their own mission that God has placed us in this world to fulfill. Thank you.
The Rohr Jewish Learning Institute has the largest collection of Jewish media online. Hit subscribe for more.